Jake's white mare wouldn't step near the farmhouse he'd bought for $100, but when she finally moved, she led him straight to a timber structure, hiding a shaft that echoed like a tomb when he dropped stones into the darkness. The iron chest, buried 45 feet below, had already killed 3 men who'd tried to reach it, and the footprints circling the hole meant someone was watching him right now. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Mercer had exactly $117 to his name when he saw the auction notice tacked to the bulletin board outside Harlow's Feed and Grain. The paper was yellowed and curling at the edges, barely clinging to the cork, with a single rusted thumbtack that looked like it might give up its hold at any moment. Most folks in Cedar Ridge walked right past that board without a second glance, their eyes skimming over the usual offerings of used tractors and stud services and firewood for sale. But Jake stopped because the words at the top of that notice seemed to jump out at him like they'd been written specifically for his eyes alone. Estate auction. The header read in bold black letters. Riverside property, 47 acres, structures included, minimum bid $100. $100 for 47 acres. Jake read it 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding, his calloused fingers tracing the words as if touch might reveal some hidden clause or catch that his eyes had missed. In a county where decent grazing land went for thousands an acre, this was either the opportunity of a lifetime or the biggest red flag he'd ever seen. Probably both, if he was being honest with himself. He was 31 years old, broke except for those $117 and tired of working other men's ranches for wages that barely kept his truck running and his horse fed. The dream of owning his own piece of land had been fading with each passing year, worn down by the reality of modern property prices and the knowledge that men like him, with no family money and no college degree, didn't get to own land anymore. They just worked it for people who did. But here was 47 acres for $100, and Jake Mercer had just enough to make that bid with $17 left over for gas and maybe a hot meal. Before we get too deep into this, tell me where you're watching from, and if you're the kind of person who believes that sometimes opportunities find you exactly when you need them most. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I've got another story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about luck and destiny. The auction was set for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on the property itself, which Jake thought was unusual but not unheard of. Estate sales sometimes happen that way, especially when the property was remote or difficult to access. He spent the 3 days leading up to Saturday asking around town about the Riverside property, and what he learned should have sent him running in the opposite direction. The land had belonged to Samuel Hartwick, a recluse who died 6 months earlier with no living relatives and considerable debts. The property had sat empty since his death, and in those 6 months it had acquired a reputation. People claimed to see lights in the old farmhouse windows at night. Hikers reported hearing voices and footsteps in the empty rooms. One teenager swore he'd seen a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching him with eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. Haunted folks said with that particular mix of skepticism and unease that small-town people reserved for things they didn't quite believe but wouldn't dismiss outright either. Cursed, others whispered, pointing to the string of misfortunes that had befallen Samuel Hartwick in his final years. His wife had left him, his crops had failed, his cattle had sickened and died, and he'd spent his last months alone in that deteriorating farmhouse, talking to people who weren't there and writing in journals that he kept hidden from prying eyes. The bank that held the mortgage wanted the property off its books, wanted it gone so badly that they'd set the minimum bid at $100 just to ensure someone would take it. They'd tried selling it at market value, then at a discount, then at a steep discount, and nobody had been interested. Land was valuable, but not when it came with the kind of reputation that kept buyers away and made neighbors nervous. Jake learned all of this over coffee at May's Diner, where information flowed more freely than the refills and everyone had an opinion about whether he was brave or stupid for even considering the auction. Old Pete Crawford, who'd ranched in Cedar Ridge for 50 years, leaned back in his booth and fixed Jake with a rheumy-eyed stare that had probably intimidated better men. "Son," Pete said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom and considerable skepticism, "there's a reason that land's going for pocket change. Samuel Hartwick was a troubled man long before he died, and that property soaked up his troubles like a sponge soaks up water. Some places hold on to darkness, hold on to the bad things that happen there, and they don't let go easy." Jake appreciated the warning, but appreciation didn't change his circumstances. He was still broke, still tired of working for wages, still desperate enough to take a chance on land that nobody else wanted. Besides, he'd grown up poor in a single-wide trailer with a father who drank away more paychecks than he brought home. He knew about darkness and bad luck and places that felt heavy with accumulated misery. If those things could be overcome with hard work and determination, he'd overcome them. If they couldn't, well, at least he'd have tried. Saturday morning arrived cool and clear, the kind of autumn day when the air tasted like wood smoke and possibilities. Jake loaded Ghost, his white quarter-horse mare, into the trailer behind his rusted Chevy pickup and drove the 12 miles to the Riverside property. He'd had Ghost for 7 years, bought her as a 3-year-old with money he'd saved from 2 summers of working double shifts at the cattle auction. She was the best thing he owned, smart and steady and loyal, in a way that made him think horses understood people better than people understood themselves. The property sat at the end of a rutted dirt road that wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing gradually into the foothills where Cedar Ridge gave way to genuine wilderness. As Jake's truck bumped and rattled over the rough track, he caught his first glimpse of the structures mentioned in the auction notice, and his breath caught in his throat, despite all his practical intentions to remain realistic about what $100 would buy. The farmhouse emerged from the landscape like something from a faded photograph, weathered and sagging but still standing with a stubborn dignity that spoke of better days. It was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch that had lost several boards to rot and time, and a tin roof that had oxidized to a patchwork of rust and faded red. The windows were dark and empty, some cracked, others covered with what looked like old blankets or boards from the inside. The whole building leaned slightly to the east, as if the prevailing winds had been pushing it in that direction for decades, and it had finally started to give in. But it was the land itself that made Jake's heart beat faster. The property stretched out from the house in rolling meadows dotted with stands of pine and cottonwood, bordered on one side by a creek that caught the morning sun and threw it back in flashes of silver and gold. The grass was tall and golden, untended for months, but still thick enough to suggest good soil beneath. In the distance, he could see the darker green of forest climbing into the hills, and beyond that the blue-gray shadows of mountains that seemed to promise something bigger than his small, struggling life. 47 acres of possibility, if he was willing to overlook whatever darkness supposedly lived in that sagging farmhouse. Jake parked his truck near a cluster of 3 other vehicles, all of them newer and cleaner than his beaten Chevy. He recognized 2 of them as belonging to real estate speculators from the county seat, men who bought distressed properties and flipped them for profit. The 3rd vehicle was an unmarked white van that probably belonged to the auctioneer or bank representative. Not much competition, which suited Jake just fine. The fewer people bidding, the better his chances of walking away with the property. He unloaded Ghost from the trailer and led her toward the house, her hooves making soft thuds on the packed earth. The mare was calm as always, her white coat gleaming in the morning sun. But as they approached the farmhouse, Jake felt her hesitate. It was subtle, just a slight resistance in the lead rope, a tension in her neck that suggested unease. Horses had instincts that people had forgotten, and Ghost's instincts were telling her something about this place made her nervous. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, running his hand along her neck. "Just old wood and bad memories, nothing that can hurt you." But Ghost's ears swiveled toward the house and stayed there, locked on something Jake couldn't see or hear, and a cold finger of doubt traced its way down his spine. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard that he consulted with the air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He introduced himself as Martin Fletcher, representing the bank, and explained the terms of the sale with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. The property would be sold as is, with no warranties or guarantees about its condition. The minimum bid was $100. Payment would be required in full before the close of business today. Any questions? One of the real estate speculators, a heavy-set man with an expensive watch and the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly desperate, raised his hand. What's the catch? Properties don't go for $100 unless there's a serious problem. Foundation issues, contamination, legal entanglements. Martin Fletcher adjusted his glasses and looked down at his clipboard as if the answer might be written there in fine print. The property has a reputation locally as being, well, troubled. Previous owner died under circumstances that some consider suspicious. There have been reports of unusual activity. The bank is simply trying to liquidate the asset and move on. Haunted, the real estate speculator said flatly. You're telling me this property is supposed to be haunted and that's why you can't sell it? The bank makes no claims about the presence or absence of paranormal activity, Fletcher replied in the careful language of someone who'd been coached by lawyers. We're simply disclosing that the property has a local reputation that may affect its resale value. The other speculator, a younger man with slicked back hair and nervous energy, laughed uncomfortably. I don't pay $100,000 in property taxes back home to waste time on haunted houses in the middle of nowhere. This is ridiculous. Then you're free to leave, Fletcher said mildly. Anyone else have questions? Jake raised his hand, and Fletcher looked at him with the faint surprise of someone noticing an insect on the wall. Yes? The structures, Jake said. Are they sound enough to occupy? I'm not worried about ghosts, but I'd like to know if the roof will hold through winter. I honestly don't know, Fletcher admitted. The property hasn't been inspected in months. You'd be taking a significant risk either way. Jake nodded slowly, his mind working through the calculations. $100 for 47 acres, a house that might collapse in the first snowstorm, and a reputation that had scared away everyone else. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble that broke men made when they'd run out of better options. The auction itself lasted less than 5 minutes. Fletcher called for opening bids, and when neither of the real estate speculators moved, Jake raised his hand and called out $100. Fletcher looked around for competing bids, found none, and brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the empty meadow. Sold to the gentleman with the horse for $100. Please see me to complete the paperwork. And just like that, Jake Mercer became a landowner. The paperwork took longer than the auction itself. Martin Fletcher produced a stack of documents that Jake had to sign, initial, and date in multiple places, each page representing some legal protection for the bank and some new responsibility for him. Transfer of deed, acknowledgement of as-is condition, waiver of inspection rights, assumption of all liens and encumbrances. Jake read each page carefully despite Fletcher's obvious impatience because his father had taught him exactly one useful lesson in life: always read what you're signing, even if it takes all day. By the time he handed over his $100 in worn $20 bills and received the deed with his name on it, the real estate speculators had driven away and the sun had climbed higher in the sky. Fletcher packed his clipboard and documents into a leather briefcase with the relieved air of someone escaping an unpleasant obligation. Good luck, he said to Jake, and there was something in his tone that suggested he thought luck, good or bad, would be the determining factor in whatever happened next. The property is yours now, for better or worse. Jake watched the white van disappear down the rutted road, its dust trail hanging in the still air like a question mark. Then he turned back to the farmhouse that was now his and felt the weight of ownership settle onto his shoulders like a heavy coat. This sagging structure, with its broken windows and rusted roof, was his responsibility now. His problem to fix, or his failure to live with. Ghost had been ground-tied near the porch, and Jake went to her first, checking her over with the automatic care of someone who valued his horse more than most people valued their relatives. She was calm again, whatever had spooked her earlier seemingly forgotten, but her ears still swiveled toward the house occasionally, as if monitoring some sound or presence that Jake couldn't detect. "Let's take a look around," he said to her, gathering her lead rope. "See what $100 bought us." They started with the exterior, walking the perimeter of the house while Jake made mental notes of everything that needed repair or replacement. The porch boards were worse than they'd looked from a distance. Half of them rotted through to the point where stepping on them would be dangerous. The foundation was stone and mortar, cracked in several places but mostly intact. The windows were a mix of broken panes and boards, and the front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, the wood swollen from weather and neglect. The barn sat about 50 yards from the house, a smaller structure that had fared slightly better against time and abandonment. Its roof was mostly intact, and the sliding door still moved on its track, with only minor protest. Inside, Jake found 3 stalls, a tack room, and a hayloft that still held a few scattered bales of dusty, moldering hay. It smelled of old horses and older memories, but the structure was sound enough that he could stable Ghost here without worry. He led Ghost into the barn, got her settled in the cleanest stall with water from his truck and a portion of the feed he'd brought, then returned to face the farmhouse itself. The front door resisted his first push, then gave way with a shriek of protesting hinges that sent a cloud of dust swirling into the dim interior. The smell hit him first, not the expected odors of decay and abandonment, but something else, something that made his nose wrinkle and his instincts prickle with unease. It was a combination of old smoke, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic that reminded him of blood, though he told himself that was just his imagination working overtime after all the ghost stories he'd heard. The interior was darker than he'd expected, the boarded windows blocking most of the afternoon light. Jake pulled a flashlight from his belt and swept its beam across the front room, revealing a space that had once been someone's living room, but now looked like a stage set for a particularly depressing play. Furniture sat draped with dusty sheets, shapes that suggested a couch, chairs, and tables, but could have been anything underneath their ghostly coverings. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and Jake could see the spines of hundreds of volumes, their titles too faded and dust-covered to read in the dim light. The floor creaked under his boots as he moved deeper into the house, each step sending up small puffs of dust that hung in the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts. To his left, a doorway led to what appeared to be a kitchen. To his right, a staircase climbed into darkness. Straight ahead, he could see another doorway, probably leading to a bedroom or study. Jake chose the kitchen first, pushing through the doorway into a room that smelled of rust and old water. The sink was stained and crusted with mineral deposits. The counters were bare except for a few scattered items that suggested someone had left in a hurry or simply stopped caring about tidiness in their final days. A coffee cup with the dregs of some ancient beverage dried to a dark crust at the bottom. A plate with what might have been bread, now reduced to a fuzzy green mass of mold. A butcher knife lying next to the plate, its blade spotted with rust or possibly something darker. The cabinets were mostly empty when he opened them, just a few cans of food with labels so faded he couldn't read what they contained, and a box of matches that looked like it had been sitting there since the previous century. The refrigerator was unplugged and empty, its door standing open to reveal shelves crusted with something dark and unidentifiable. Jake moved back through the living room and climbed the stairs, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The staircase held, though it creaked and groaned like it was complaining about being disturbed after months of silence. The second floor consisted of 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all of them in various states of disrepair and neglect. The master bedroom was the largest, with windows that looked out over the meadow and distant mountains. Someone had lived here recently enough that the bed was still made, though the sheets were dusty and stained. A dresser stood against one wall, its drawers hanging open and empty. A nightstand held a lamp with a broken shade and a glass of water that had long since evaporated, leaving only a ring of mineral deposits at the bottom. But it was the second bedroom that stopped Jake in his tracks and made his pulse quicken with something between excitement and apprehension. The second bedroom had been converted into some kind of study or office, but it was unlike any workspace Jake had ever seen. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with papers, photographs, maps, and diagrams, all of them connected by lengths of string or yarn in different colors, creating a web of information that looked like the work of either a brilliant investigator or a deeply troubled mind. Possibly both. Jake stepped into the room slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls and revealing layer upon layer of obsessive documentation. There were photographs of the property from different angles and different seasons, some of them recent and some clearly decades old. Maps of the surrounding area with certain locations circled in red ink. Newspaper clippings about local history, mining operations, and unexplained disappearances. Handwritten notes in a cramped, urgent script that covered every available surface. In the center of the room sat a desk buried under stacks of notebooks and journals, their covers worn and stained from constant handling. Jake picked up the top journal and opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the handwriting that belonged to Samuel Hartwick, the previous owner who had died alone in this house. "They don't understand what's buried here," the entry read. "I've spent 15 years searching, and I'm close now. So close I can feel it pulling at me even in my sleep." The maps were right. The old surveyor's documents don't lie. It's here somewhere on this property, and when I find it, everything will make sense. Everything will finally make sense. Jake flipped through more pages, finding similar entries dated over the span of years. References to something buried, something hidden, something that Hartwick believed would vindicate his obsession. The handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed, the words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence or repeating the same phrases over and over. The last entry was dated 3 days before Hartwick's death. "I hear them at night now, the voices of the men who died here. They want me to find it, want someone to finally uncover the truth. My wife thinks I'm insane. She left yesterday, said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore, but she doesn't understand. This isn't destruction. This is purpose. This is the only thing that's ever mattered." Jake set the journal down carefully, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Samuel Hartwick had been searching for something, had devoted years of his life to finding something he believed was buried on this property. The obsession had cost him his marriage, his health, and possibly his sanity. And now, Jake owned the land that had consumed Hartwick so completely. He spent the next hour exploring the rest of the house, but kept returning to that second bedroom and its walls of documentation. There was something compelling about Hartwick's obsession, something that spoke to Jake's own desperate need to find meaning and purpose in his struggling life. A man didn't cover walls with maps and photographs unless he believed in something deeply enough to stake everything on it. By late afternoon, Jake had seen enough of the house to know that making it livable would require more work than he could accomplish in a few days, or even a few weeks. The roof needed patching, the windows needed replacing, the floors needed reinforcing, and every surface needed scrubbing. But the structure was fundamentally sound, the bones were good, and with time and effort, he could turn this haunted shell into something resembling a home. He retrieved Ghost from the barn and began exploring the property itself, riding slowly across the meadows and through the stands of trees, getting a feel for the land that was now his. The creek that bordered the eastern edge was clear and cold, fed by springs somewhere up in the hills. The grass was thick and nutritious despite months of neglect. The soil was dark and rich where the meadow gave way to forest. This was good land, valuable land, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to its cheap sale price than just ghost stories and local superstition. Ghost moved easily beneath him. Her stride relaxed now that they were away from the house. Whatever had bothered her near the farmhouse didn't seem to extend to the rest of the property, and Jake found himself relaxing as well, enjoying the simple pleasure of riding across land that belonged to him. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things. 47 acres was a small spread by ranching standards, but it was his, and that made all the difference. They were following the creek toward the northern boundary when Ghost suddenly stopped, her ears pricking forward with sharp interest. Jake felt her entire body tense beneath him, every muscle coiled and ready, but this wasn't the nervous tension she'd shown at the house. This was something else. Curiosity mixed with alertness, the way a horse reacted when she'd spotted something unusual, but not necessarily threatening. "What is it, girl?" Jake asked, scanning the area ahead for whatever had caught her attention. The creek bent sharply to the left about 30 yards ahead, disappearing into a thick stand of cottonwood trees. The afternoon sun slanted through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the water that made it difficult to see clearly. But Ghost was staring at something specific, her gaze locked on a point just beyond the bend. Jake dismounted and led her forward on foot, moving slowly and quietly. As they rounded the bend, he saw what had caught her attention and felt his breath catch in his throat. There was a structure partially hidden in the trees, so overgrown with vegetation that Jake had almost missed it entirely. It wasn't a building exactly, more like a framework or scaffold made of old timber, maybe 10 feet tall and twice as wide. The wood was weathered gray and draped with vines, but the structure itself looked deliberately constructed rather than naturally formed. Someone had built this, and built it to last. Jake approached cautiously, Ghost following close behind him. As he got closer, he could see that the structure wasn't random or decorative. It was positioned directly over what looked like a depression in the ground, a circular area about 6 feet across where the earth had settled or been excavated at some point in the past. The timber framework formed a kind of support system around this depression, with cross beams and braces suggesting it had once held something heavy or supported some kind of mechanism. An old well, maybe, or a mine shaft, Jake thought. But the design was odd, more elaborate than a simple well would require, and there was something about the positioning and construction that suggested a different purpose. He tied Ghost to a nearby tree and circled the structure, examining it from different angles. The timber was old but still solid, probably cedar or some other rot-resistant wood. Someone had invested considerable time and skill in building this framework and had positioned it with clear intention in this specific spot. The question was why. Jake knelt at the edge of the depression and peered down into the darkness below. The hole went deeper than his flashlight beam could penetrate, disappearing into shadows that might be a few feet down or a few dozen feet. He picked up a rock and dropped it into the opening, listening for the sound of it hitting bottom. The rock fell for longer than he expected, and when it finally landed, the sound was wrong. Not the thud of stone hitting earth, but a hollow metallic clang that echoed up from the depths like a bell being struck in a cathedral. The metallic echo from the depths seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded, as if the sound itself was reluctant to die. Jake remained kneeling at the edge of the depression, his mind working through the implications of what he'd just heard. Metal that deep underground, in a location marked by an elaborate timber structure, on property that had consumed a man's final years with obsessive searching. This was what Samuel Hartwick had been looking for, had to be. Ghost nickered softly behind him, a sound that carried equal parts curiosity and concern. Jake stood and returned to her, running his hand along her neck in the automatic gesture of reassurance that had become second nature over their years together. She pressed her nose against his shoulder, her warm breath dampening his shirt, and he found himself grateful for her presence. There was something unsettling about standing alone at the edge of a mysterious hole that rang like a bell when you dropped stones into it. "We need equipment," he said to Ghost, who flicked her ears in response. "Rope, lights, maybe some lumber to shore up the edges. This has been here for decades, probably longer. Another day won't make a difference." But even as he said it, Jake felt the pull of curiosity warring with common sense. Every instinct told him that whatever lay at the bottom of that shaft was significant, possibly valuable, definitely the answer to questions that Samuel Hartwick had died without resolving. The responsible thing would be to wait, to plan, to approach this discovery with caution and proper preparation. The desperate thing would be to find a way down there as soon as possible, before darkness fell, or doubt crept in, or whatever haunted this property decided to interfere. Jake had spent most of his life being responsible, and it had gotten him nowhere except broken, tired, and working other men's land. Maybe it was time to try desperate instead. He rode Ghost back to the farmhouse as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, already making mental lists of what he needed. The barn had yielded some coiled rope during his earlier exploration, old but still serviceable. His truck held a better flashlight than the one on his belt, along with basic tools and supplies. He'd need something to anchor the rope and a way to lower himself safely into unknown depths. The next 2 hours were spent in preparation. Jake found the rope in the barn and tested its strength by looping it around a post and pulling with all his weight. It held without protest, and though it was rough hemp rather than modern climbing rope, it would serve the purpose. He fashioned a simple harness from the rope and additional lengths of webbing he found in the tack room, testing and retesting each knot until he was confident it would hold. By the time he rode back to the timber structure, the sun had dropped low enough that the forest was filling with shadows, but there was still enough daylight left for what he intended. Jake secured one end of the rope around the largest cottonwood tree, testing the anchor point multiple times before feeding the other end down into the hole. The rope disappeared into darkness, and even after he'd let out what he estimated to be 40 feet, he still hadn't felt it hit bottom. This was deeper than he'd thought, deep enough that falling would mean serious injury or death, deep enough that whatever was down there had been hidden with clear intention by people who wanted it to stay hidden. Jake stood at the edge with the rope in his hands and the harness around his chest, asking himself one final time if this was really worth the risk. Then he thought about the $117 he'd had to his name this morning, about the years of working for wages that barely kept him alive, about Samuel Hartwick covering walls with maps and dying alone with his obsession unfulfilled. Sometimes you had to take risks that looked insane from the outside, because the alternative was accepting that your life would never be more than what it already was. Jake secured the flashlight to his belt and began his descent. The first few feet were manageable, the rope sliding through his gloved hands with controlled friction as he walked backward down the shaft's earthen walls. But as he dropped below ground level and the circle of daylight above him shrank, the temperature dropped noticeably and the smell of damp earth grew stronger. The walls were surprisingly smooth, carved rather than naturally formed, suggesting this shaft had been deliberately excavated by people with specific goals and considerable skill. 10 feet down, the earthen walls gave way to stone, old bedrock that had been cut through with tools that had left marks Jake could feel beneath his hands. 20 feet down, the shaft widened slightly, and Jake could see the gleam of his flashlight reflecting off something metal embedded in the rock wall. 30 feet down, he began to question the wisdom of this entire enterprise as the rope creaked and his arms ached from controlling his descent. Then, at what he estimated to be 45 feet below the surface, his boots touched something solid, and the sound they made on impact was that same hollow metallic ring he'd heard when the rock fell. Jake played his flashlight around what turned out to be a chamber, rather than simply the bottom of a shaft. The space was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling low enough that he could touch it if he reached up. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made his breath catch and his heart hammer against his ribs. A massive iron chest sat on a stone platform in the middle of the chamber, easily 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, its surface covered with rust and what looked like deliberately etched symbols or writing. The chest was secured with 3 heavy locks, all of them corroded but still intact, and reinforced with iron bands that had been riveted into place with obvious permanence. This wasn't something meant to be opened easily or often. Jake approached the chest slowly, his flashlight revealing more details with each step. The symbols etched into its surface weren't random decoration. They formed patterns and sequences that looked deliberate, purposeful, possibly some kind of code or warning. Around the base of the chest, the stone platform bore more inscriptions, words carved deep into the rock in a language Jake didn't recognize, but that had the formal, precise quality of something official, something meant to last. He reached out and touched the iron surface, feeling the rough texture of oxidized metal beneath his gloves. The chest was real, solid, impossibly heavy based on how it sat on the platform. Whatever was inside had weight and substance, and had been important enough that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it 4 stories underground in a sealed chamber. This was what Samuel Hartwick had been searching for, what his maps and photographs and obsessive documentation had been leading him toward. The man had died without finding it, had spent his final years so close to this buried treasure that the walls of his study were probably covered with images of the exact spot where Jake now stood. A sound from above made Jake freeze, his hand still resting on the chest. It was faint but distinct, the sound of something moving near the top of the shaft. Rocks shifting maybe, or dirt falling, or something else, something that had followed him down or been waiting for him to arrive. Ghost's whinny carried down the shaft, sharp with alarm, and Jake felt his stomach clench with sudden fear. He'd tied her securely to the tree, but horses could break free when frightened, and Ghost sounded terrified. Jake grabbed the rope and began climbing before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. Years of ranch work had given him the strength and endurance to pull himself up 45 feet of rope, but doing it quickly while weighted with equipment and fear for his horse was another matter entirely. His arms burned within the first 10 feet, his shoulders screaming protest as he hauled himself upward hand over hand, boots scrabbling against the stone walls for purchase. Above him, Ghost's distress was escalating. She wasn't just nervous now, she was panicking, her whinnies punctuated by the sound of hooves striking earth and the creak of rope against tree bark as she pulled against her tether. Jake had never heard her sound like this, not in 7 years of storms and coyotes and all the other dangers that came with life on the frontier. "Easy, girl," Jake shouted upward, though he doubted she could hear him over her own fear. "I'm coming. Just hold on." 20 feet up, his hands were cramping despite the gloves, the rope burning against his palms through the leather. 30 feet up, he risked a glance toward the surface and saw the circle of dusky sky that marked the top of the shaft. It looked impossibly far away, and for a terrible moment Jake wondered if he'd have the strength to reach it. Then he heard the sound that explained Ghost's terror, and his own fear gave him the burst of adrenaline he needed to keep climbing. Something was moving around the top of the shaft, circling the opening with deliberate steps that were too heavy to be a coyote and too purposeful to be a deer. Jake could hear the footfalls clearly now, boots on dirt, human boots walking a slow perimeter around the hole where he was trapped. "Who's up there?" Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence broken by Ghost's frightened breathing. Then a voice drifted down the shaft, male and rough and carrying an accent Jake couldn't quite place. "Private property," the voice repeated, and there was amusement in it that made Jake's skin crawl. "That's interesting, considering you bought this land less than 12 hours ago. Seems a bit presumptuous to claim ownership so quickly. Jake pulled himself up another few feet, his arms trembling with effort. Who are you and what do you want? My name is Thomas Crane, and what I want is sitting in that chamber beneath you. The voice was conversational now, almost friendly. I've been watching this property for 6 months, waiting for the bank to finally sell it to someone fool enough to take the bait. Congratulations on being that fool. The implications of those words hit Jake like a physical blow. This man had been waiting, watching, planning. The auction, the ridiculously low price, maybe even Samuel Hartwick's death, all of it potentially orchestrated to put someone, anyone, in position to find what lay at the bottom of this shaft. You killed Hartwick, Jake said, still climbing but slower now, conserving his strength while he processed this new information. Crane laughed, the sound echoing down the shaft like stones falling into deep water. Samuel Hartwick killed himself with obsession. I just helped him along when it became clear he'd never find what he was looking for. The man spent 15 years searching and never once thought to check the journals his own grandfather left behind. Family history, Mr. Mercer. That's always the key. Jake reached the 30-foot mark, 2/3 of the way to the surface. His arms felt like they might tear from his shoulders, but fear was a powerful motivator. What's in the chest? That depends on which stories you believe. Crane's voice carried a dreamlike quality now, the tone of someone discussing legends rather than practical matters. Some say it's gold from the territorial mining days, hidden by prospectors who never returned to claim it. Others say it's documents, evidence of crimes committed by powerful men who paid to have them buried and forgotten. My personal favorite is the story about Confederate Treasury gold, supposedly moved west after the war and hidden in locations only a few trusted men knew about. Jake pulled himself up another few feet, now close enough to the surface that he could see the darkening sky in detail. The sun had set while he was underground, and dusk was settling over the property, with the kind of purple-gray light that made shadows deeper and distances harder to judge. The truth, Crane continued, is that I don't particularly care what's in the chest. What I care about is that it's valuable enough that men have died protecting its location, and valuable enough that the bank would rather sell this land for $100 than risk anyone finding it. That kind of secrecy means money, Mr. Mercer. Real money. The kind that changes lives. Jake was close now, maybe 10 feet from the top, close enough that he could hear Crane's breathing above the sound of Ghost's panic, close enough to see the man's shadow crossing the opening, blocking the fading light in intervals as he paced. Here's what's going to happen, Crane said, his tone hardening. You're going to climb out of that hole, and you're going to tell me exactly what you saw down there. Then you're going to help me retrieve whatever's in that chest, because I don't have the equipment or the inclination to climb down myself, and if you cooperate, I might let you keep your horse and your truck and drive away from here with your life. And if I don't cooperate, Jake asked, though he already knew the answer, then your horse becomes mine, your truck becomes mine, this property becomes mine, and you become another cautionary tale about trespassing on land where you don't belong. Crane's shadow fell across the opening completely now, blocking what little light remained. Samuel Hartwick trusted the wrong people and died alone in a house nobody wanted. You trusted a bank auction that seemed too good to be true, and you'll die alone in a hole nobody knows exists. The patterns repeat themselves, Mr. Mercer. It's almost poetic. Jake hung from the rope 10 feet below the surface, his arms screaming and his mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly. Crane had the high ground, probably had weapons, and definitely had the advantage of not being exhausted from climbing 45 feet of rope twice in the span of an hour. But Jake also had something Crane didn't have, something the man couldn't see or plan for from his position at the top of the shaft. During his descent and exploration of the chamber, Jake had noticed something about the timber structure that supported the shaft opening. The cross beams were old and weathered, held together more by habit than structural integrity. And they were supporting not just their own weight, but also the weight of anyone standing directly above the opening. It was a desperate plan, possibly a stupid plan, but desperate and stupid had gotten Jake this far today. Sometimes you had to bet everything on a single move and hope luck was on your side for once. "I'll cooperate," Jake called up, forcing his voice to sound defeated and scared. "Just don't hurt my horse, she's all I've got." Crane's shadow shifted, and Jake could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he replied, "Smart choice. Now climb up slowly, keep your hands where I can see them, and we'll discuss terms like reasonable men." Jake began climbing again, but this time he angled his ascent toward the western edge of the shaft, where the timber support beam looked most compromised by rot and age. Ghost had quieted somewhat, her terror giving way to exhausted confusion, and Jake sent a silent apology in her direction for what he was about to do. 3 feet from the top, Jake reached out and grabbed the timber crossbeam with both hands, then pulled himself up with all the force his exhausted muscles could generate. The timber beam groaned under the sudden weight, decades of rot and weather damage finally meeting their breaking point. Jake felt it shift beneath his grip, heard the sharp crack of wood fibers separating, and for a terrible instant he hung suspended between the shaft and the surface, uncertain whether he was about to climb to safety or plunge back into the darkness below. Then the beam gave way completely, breaking free from its supporting posts with a shriek of tortured wood. The timber structure collapsed inward, cross beams and support posts tumbling down the shaft in a cascade of splintering lumber and loosened earth. Jake threw himself to the side as the beam he'd been gripping fell past him, his hands scrambling for purchase on the edge of the opening as the ground beneath began to crumble. Above him, Thomas Crane shouted in alarm as the platform he'd been standing on disintegrated. Jake caught a glimpse of the man stumbling backward, arms windmilling for balance, before a cloud of dust and falling debris obscured everything. The rope Jake had been climbing went slack as its anchor tree was pulled forward by the collapsing structure, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jake was falling, his fingers clawing at dirt and rock and anything that might stop his descent back into the chamber. His left hand found something solid, a root or rock embedded in the shaft wall, and he grabbed it with desperate strength. His body slammed against the earthen wall hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, but the root held. He hung there gasping and coughing, covered in dirt and dust, his ears ringing from the noise of the collapse. The dust began to settle, revealing the chaos above. The timber structure was gone, reduced to a pile of broken lumber at the bottom of the shaft. The opening had widened considerably, the edges crumbling inward and turning what had been a neat 6-foot circle into an irregular gap twice that size. Jake could see the darkening sky clearly now, stars beginning to appear in the purple twilight, and silhouetted against that sky was Ghost, still tied to her tree, but now visible from his position. Of Thomas Crane, there was no immediate sign. Jake pulled himself up using the root as leverage, his arms protesting but obeying through sheer force of will. He made it to the edge of the widened opening and dragged himself out onto solid ground, rolling away from the crumbling edge and lying flat on his back while his body recovered from exertions it hadn't been designed for. Ghost whinnied, a sound of relief rather than fear now, and Jake managed to turn his head toward her. She was maybe 20 feet away, still secured to her tree, watching him with large, dark eyes that seemed to ask whether he'd finally finished doing stupid, dangerous things for the day. "Not yet, girl," Jake muttered, forcing himself to sit up. Not quite yet. Movement to his left caught his attention, and Jake turned to see Thomas Crane pulling himself up from behind a fallen log. The man had apparently thrown himself clear of the collapsing structure just in time, though his clothes were torn and he had a bleeding cut above his left eye that painted half his face with a mask of blood in the fading light. Crane stared at Jake with an expression that combined fury, disbelief, and grudging respect. "You just destroyed the only safe access to that chamber," he said, his voice rough with dust and anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jake got slowly to his feet, his body protesting every movement, but obeying through sheer stubborn determination. "I know I'm still alive and you're not standing over that hole anymore. Seems like a win from my perspective." Crane wiped blood from his eye with the back of his hand, leaving a rusty smear across his cheek. "You're a fool, Mercer. That chest down there is worth more than you'll make in 10 lifetimes of ranch work. We could have split it, could have both walked away rich. Instead, you've trapped it under tons of collapsed timber in a shaft that's now unstable and dangerous." "Good," Jake replied, moving toward Ghost while keeping Crane in his peripheral vision. "Maybe it should stay trapped. Whatever's down there has been killing people for long enough." Crane laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think destroying the access point changes anything? I have the maps, the documents, the family journals that Hartwick never found. I can hire excavation equipment, proper engineers, dig a new shaft if necessary. This is a delay, not a defeat." Jake reached Ghost and began untying her lead rope, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Then you'd better get started because this property belongs to me now. I've got the deed in my truck, signed and legal. And if I see you here again without permission, I'll call the sheriff and report you for trespassing, assault, and attempted murder." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the ruined excavation site, the air between them charged with tension and unspoken threats. Crane was older than Jake had initially thought, probably mid-50s, with gray streaking his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent pursuing goals that had cost him more than he'd gained. "This isn't over," Crane said finally, his voice carrying quiet conviction rather than bluster. "That chest contains something important enough that my grandfather spent his entire life protecting its location, and something valuable enough that powerful men paid to keep it hidden. I've invested 6 months and considerable resources into finding it, and I don't abandon investments." "Then I guess we'll see each other again," Jake replied, gathering Ghost's lead rope and preparing to mount. "But next time, come during daylight hours and knock on the front door like a civilized person. This sneaking around in the dark and threatening people isn't winning you any allies." "I don't need allies," Crane said, already backing away toward the tree line where Jake could now see a vehicle parked partially hidden in the shadows. "I need that chest, and I'll do whatever's necessary to get it. You should remember that before you get too attached to this property." Then Crane was gone, disappearing into the darkening forest with surprising speed for a man who'd just survived a structural collapse. Jake heard an engine start somewhere in the distance, saw headlights briefly illuminate the trees before fading away down what must be an old logging road or game trail. Jake stood alone in the gathering darkness, Ghost pressed warm and solid against his side, staring at the ruined excavation site that now looked like something had exploded from underground rather than collapsed from above. The timber structure that had marked the location for decades was gone, reduced to kindling at the bottom of a shaft that was now too dangerous to attempt descending again without proper equipment and engineering. But the chest was still down there, 45 feet below ground, containing something that men had killed to protect and died trying to find. And Jake now owned the property that held it, which made him either the luckiest man in Cedar Ridge or the next victim in a pattern that stretched back generations. He mounted Ghost and turned her toward the farmhouse, now just a darker shadow against the darkening sky. His body ached in places he hadn't known could ache. His clothes were torn and filthy, and he had maybe $12 left to his name after buying this cursed property. But he also had 47 acres of land, a secret that had consumed better men than himself, and apparently a dangerous enemy who wouldn't stop until he got what he'd been searching for. As they rode slowly back toward the barn, Jake found himself thinking about Samuel Hartwick and the walls covered with documentation about the obsession that had cost the man everything he had. The smart thing would be to forget about the chest, to focus on making the farmhouse livable and turning this property into a working ranch. The smart thing would be to call the sheriff in the morning and report everything that had happened with Thomas Crane. But Jake wasn't feeling particularly smart right now. He was feeling curious and stubborn and increasingly convinced that whatever was in that chest was connected to why this land had been priced at $100, despite being worth hundreds of thousands. Someone wanted this property to change hands, wanted someone to find that chest, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become a player in a game whose rules he didn't understand. Jake spent that first night in the farmhouse despite every instinct telling him to drive back to town and sleep somewhere that didn't creak and groan with every gust of wind. He'd settled Ghost in the barn with fresh water and the rest of his feed supply, then hauled his sleeping bag and supplies into the least damaged downstairs room, a small parlor that had once been someone's reading space, judging by the built-in bookshelves and the faded armchair positioned near the window. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the sounds of an old house settling and his mind replaying the day's events on an endless loop. The chest in the chamber below ground, Thomas Crane's threats, the metallic echo of stone hitting iron, the symbols etched into rust-covered metal. Each time Jake closed his eyes, he saw those strange markings, formal and deliberate, clearly meant to convey information to someone who understood their language. By dawn, he'd gotten maybe 3 hours of actual rest, but his mind was clearer than it had been since he'd first read that auction notice. He had a property, a mystery, and an enemy. The property he could work with, the mystery he could investigate, and the enemy he'd have to deal with when the time came. First things first meant understanding exactly what Samuel Hartwick had discovered during his 15 years of obsessive research. Jake returned to the second-floor study as soon as there was enough light to see clearly. The walls of documentation looked even more overwhelming in the morning sun, thousands of hours of work covering every available surface. But now Jake knew what he was looking for, could focus his attention on the specific area where Hartwick's research had led him closest to the truth. The maps were the key, Jake realized as he studied them more carefully. Hartwick had collected or created dozens of maps showing the property from different time periods, some dating back to the territorial days before Wyoming had become a state. The oldest maps showed features that no longer existed, including what appeared to be mining operations and structures that had long since been reclaimed by nature. One map in particular caught Jake's attention, a hand-drawn survey from 1873 that marked several locations with symbols matching those Jake had seen on the iron chest. The symbols appeared at 5 different points on the property, arranged in a rough circle with the excavation site near the creek at the center. Whatever system Hartwick had been investigating, it was larger than just the single shaft Jake had discovered. Jake carefully removed the map from the wall, folding it and tucking it into his jacket pocket. Then he began sorting through the journals, looking for entries that referenced those symbols or explained what Hartwick had learned about their meaning. It took him most of the morning, but eventually he found a section dated 2 years before Hartwick's death that laid out the man's theory in detail. The symbols are markers, Hartwick had written in his cramped handwriting. My research suggests they were placed by the Territorial Surveyor's Office in the 1870s, during a period when the federal government was cataloging natural resources throughout the Western Territories. But these weren't standard geological markers. These were designating something else, something that required specialized knowledge to interpret. I've traced the surveyor responsible to a man named Josiah Crane, grandfather to Thomas Crane, who currently works as a private investigator in Cheyenne. Josiah was discharged from his government position in 1876 under suspicious circumstances, shortly after completing his survey of this region. Official records claim incompetence and falsification of documents. Unofficial sources suggest he was removed because he found something the government didn't want found, or because he tried to profit from knowledge he gained through his position. Jake sat back in Hartwick's chair, the journal open on his lap, connecting pieces that Hartwick had assembled but never fully understood. Thomas Crane wasn't just some random treasure hunter. He was the grandson of the man who had originally surveyed this property, who had placed those symbols and created the system that marked the locations of whatever was buried here. That's how Crane had known about the chest, had known to watch and wait for someone to buy the property and start investigating. The journals revealed more as Jake continued reading. Hartwick had managed to track down some of Josiah Crane's personal papers, purchased from an estate sale by pure luck. Those papers included references to a project that Josiah called the Territorial Repository, a system for preserving evidence and valuables that certain government officials wanted protected but hidden from public knowledge. The 1870s were a complicated time in the territories, Hartwick wrote. The federal government was trying to establish control while dealing with territorial governors who operated more like feudal lords than elected officials. There was massive corruption, theft of natural resources, exploitation of native populations, and crimes that were ignored or covered up because the perpetrators had political connections. Some officials apparently recognized that evidence of these crimes needed to be preserved, possibly for future prosecution, or possibly as insurance against their enemies. According to Josiah's papers, he was tasked with creating hidden repositories throughout his survey territory, places where documents and valuables could be stored safely away from those who might want them destroyed. He used his position as surveyor to identify suitable locations, then worked with engineers and craftsmen to create secure underground chambers that could withstand time and weather. The symbols he placed marked these locations, but only someone with the key to interpreting them would know what they meant. Jake set down the journal and stared at the map in his hands with new understanding. There were 5 marked locations on his property, which meant 4 more chambers like the one he'd discovered, 4 more iron chests filled with documents or valuables or whatever else had been deemed important enough to hide underground for more than a century and a half. But why had the government allowed this land to be sold if they knew what was buried here? That question bothered Jake more than any other aspect of this mystery. If these chambers contained evidence of historical crimes or valuable government documents, there should have been protections in place to prevent the property from changing hands. Unless the current government didn't know these repositories existed, or unless they decided that whatever was buried here was no longer worth protecting. A sound from downstairs interrupted Jake's thoughts. The distinctive creak of the front door opening, followed by footsteps crossing the floor. Jake moved quietly to the study door, peering down the staircase toward the entrance hall. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes and revealing a figure standing just inside the doorway. For a moment, Jake thought Thomas Crane had returned despite the daylight warning, but the silhouette was wrong. Shorter and stockier than Crane's lean frame. The visitor stepped further into the house, and Jake recognized Dr. Morrison from Cedar Ridge, the veterinarian who treated Ghost last winter when she'd gotten into some bad feed. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Morrison called out, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Are you here? I saw your truck outside." Jake came down the stairs, Hartwick's journal still in his hand. "Dr. Morrison, didn't expect to see you out here." The veterinarian looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the deteriorating interior with obvious concern. "I heard you bought the Hartwick place at auction yesterday. Wanted to check on you, make sure you're all right. This property has a reputation and folks in town are worried." "I'm fine," Jake replied, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. "Been exploring the place, getting a feel for what needs repair. There was no point mentioning the underground chamber or Thomas Crane's threats. Not yet. Not until he'd figured out what he was really dealing with." "Doctor." Morrison moved further into the house, his boots leaving prints in the dust that covered the floor. He was in his 60s, Jake knew, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of making house calls to remote ranches in all kinds of weather. But there was something different about him today. A tension in his shoulders that suggested this visit was about more than simple neighborly concern. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Morrison began, then paused as if reconsidering his words. "Jake, if I may, I need to tell you something about this property that most folks in Cedar Ridge don't know, something that Samuel Hartwick discovered shortly before he died." Jake gestured toward the parlor where he'd spent the night. "Maybe we should sit down for this conversation." They settled into the dusty furniture, Dr. Morrison choosing the armchair while Jake took a seat on the floor with his back against the wall. The older man seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance while he decided how to proceed. "My father was the town doctor before me," Dr. Morrison said finally, "back in the 1930s and 40s, when this area was even more remote than it is now. He kept detailed records of every patient he treated, every injury he saw, every suspicious death that crossed his examination table. When he retired, he gave me those records with specific instructions. Some things, he told me, needed to be remembered even if they couldn't be acted upon at the time." Jake waited, sensing that interrupting would break whatever resolve Dr. Morrison had built up to have this conversation. "In 1942, my father treated a man named Gerald Whitmore for injuries consistent with a severe beating. Whitmore was a mining engineer who'd been hired to survey this property by the Territorial Historical Society. He claimed he'd been attacked by unknown assailants and warned to stop his investigation. 3 days later, he disappeared. His body was never found, but my father always suspected murder." The story made Jake think of Josiah Crane and the Territorial Repository System. An engineer surveying the property in 1942 might have discovered the underground chambers, or at least found evidence they existed. "Samuel Hartwick came to see me about 6 months before he died," Dr. Morrison continued. "He'd been researching the property's history and came across references to Whitmore's disappearance in old newspaper archives. Hartwick wanted to know if my father had left any records about the case. I showed him the files, and that's when things started to get dangerous." "How so?" Jake asked. "Hartwick became convinced that Whitmore had found something that certain people didn't want discovered. He started asking questions around town, contacting historical societies, trying to trace what had happened to Whitmore's survey notes. Within a week, he'd received the first warning, an anonymous letter telling him to stop digging into the past or face consequences." "Did he stop?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Morrison shook his head. "Samuel Hartwick was many things, but he wasn't a coward. He kept investigating, kept compiling evidence, kept getting closer to whatever truth was buried on this land. The last time I saw him, about 2 weeks before his death, he told me he'd finally figured it out. Said he knew where the chamber was located, knew what it contained, and knew who was trying to keep it secret." "Thomas Crane," Jake said quietly. Dr. Morrison looked at him sharply. "You've met him. Last night. He was waiting when I found the chamber." Jake briefly explained the confrontation and the collapse of the timber structure, watching as understanding dawned on the veterinarian's face. "Then you're in more danger than you realize," Dr. Morrison said grimly. "The Crane family has been connected to this property for 3 generations, and they've protected its secrets with violence when necessary. Thomas Crane's father was investigated for assault in the 70s when a historian started asking questions about the territorial survey. The investigation was dropped for lack of evidence, but the historian left town and never returned. Jake absorbed this information, adding it to what he'd learned from Hartwick's journals. The pattern was clear. Anyone who got too close to discovering what the chambers contained ended up dead, missing, or frightened into silence." "Why are you telling me this now?" Jake asked. "You could have warned me before the auction." Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "I thought about it, but the truth is this property needed new ownership. It's been sitting empty for 6 months, deteriorating, becoming a blight on the community. And the Crane family needs to be stopped, has needed to be stopped for decades. When I heard a young man with no connections to the area had won the auction, I thought maybe you'd have a better chance than Hartwick did. Someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The logic was cold, but Jake couldn't entirely disagree with it. He'd bought this property because he was desperate enough to take risks that more sensible people wouldn't consider. That same desperation might be the only thing that allowed him to survive what came next. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out an envelope yellowed with age. "Hartwick gave this to me for safekeeping 2 days before he died. Made me promise to give it to whoever bought the property next. He said if he was right about what was in the chamber, the new owner would need this information to understand what they were protecting." Jake took the envelope, feeling the weight of folded papers inside. "What's in it?" "I don't know." Hartwick sealed it and asked me not to open it. He said the information was dangerous to anyone who knew it, and he didn't want me caught in the crossfire of whatever happened next. Jake carefully opened the envelope, revealing several pages of handwritten notes in Hartwick's familiar cramped script. But before he could begin reading, a sharp whinny from the barn cut through the morning air. Ghost's alarm call, the same terrified sound she'd made when Thomas Crane had appeared at the excavation site. Both men stood immediately, Jake already moving toward the door. Dr. Morrison followed, his hand reaching instinctively for his phone. Through the window, Jake could see Ghost in the corral next to the barn, her white coat bright against the dark wood. She was staring at something in the tree line beyond the barn, her entire body rigid with tension. Jake grabbed his rifle from where he'd left it by the door and headed outside at a run, Hartwick's envelope stuffed hastily into his pocket. As he approached the barn, Ghost broke from her frozen stance and began circling the corral, her hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. She wasn't just nervous. She was tracking something, her head turning to follow movement that Jake couldn't yet see. Then he saw what had spooked her and his blood ran cold. There were footprints in the soft earth near the barn, fresh ones that hadn't been there when Jake had checked on Ghost at dawn. The prints were large, made by boots with distinctive treads, and they led from the tree line directly to the barn door before circling around toward the collapsed excavation site. Thomas Crane had returned, and this time he hadn't bothered with threats or conversation. He'd come prepared to dig. Jake followed the footprints at a run, rifle in hand, with Dr. Morrison struggling to keep pace behind him. The trail led exactly where Jake expected, toward the collapsed excavation site where Thomas Crane presumably had equipment staged to begin digging. But as they rounded the stand of cottonwoods that blocked the view of the creek, Jake pulled up short at a scene that made no sense. Ghost was there, standing at the edge of the ruined shaft, but she wasn't alone. Thomas Crane lay on the ground nearby, conscious but clearly injured, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. And standing between the man and the horse, looking as confused as Jake felt, was Sheriff Linda Vargas from Cedar Ridge, her service weapon drawn and her radio crackling with dispatcher chatter. "Mr. Mercer," the sheriff said, her tone professional but relieved. "Glad you're here. I need to understand what's been happening on your property." Jake lowered his rifle slowly, his mind racing to catch up with the unexpected presence of law enforcement. "Sheriff, I can explain, but first, how did you know to come here?" "I didn't," Vargas replied. "I've been investigating Mr. Crane here for the past 6 months on suspicion of breaking and entering, stalking, and possibly being connected to Samuel Hartwick's death. When Dr. Morrison called this morning saying he was coming to check on you, I decided to follow and keep an eye on things. Good thing I did, because I arrived just in time to see Mr. Crane pulling excavation equipment out of a truck he'd hidden on the old logging road." Thomas Crane groaned from his position on the ground, his face pale with pain but his eyes still sharp with calculation. "That's trespassing, Sheriff. I have every right to be on this property. My grandfather's survey work gives me legal claim to anything found here. Your grandfather's illegal repository system doesn't give you claim to anything, Vargas replied coolly. And we both know it. I've been building a case against you for months, Mr. Crane. Tax fraud, document forgery, assault of a 70-year-old librarian in Cheyenne who wouldn't give you access to restricted archives. The breaking and entering charges alone will keep you busy with lawyers for the next year. Jake moved closer, keeping his rifle pointed safely at the ground but ready if needed. What happened to his leg? Your horse happened, Vargas said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. Mr. Crane was approaching the excavation site with a shovel when your mare came charging out of nowhere and knocked him flat. He fell badly and from the looks of it broke his tibia. I've already called for an ambulance. Jake looked at Ghost, who was now calmly grazing near the tree line, as if she hadn't just taken down a man twice her weight. His beautiful white mare, who had seemed spooked by this property from the moment they arrived, had apparently decided that enough was enough and taken matters into her own hooves. Dr. Morrison joined them, breathing hard from the run. His expression shifted from concern to satisfaction when he saw Crane on the ground. Thomas, he said with no warmth in his voice, your father would be ashamed of what you've become. Crane laughed bitterly. My father spent his life protecting a secret that nobody appreciated. My grandfather created something important, and it's been wasted, buried, forgotten. I was just trying to reclaim what should have been our family's legacy. Sheriff Vargas holstered her weapon and pulled out handcuffs. Your family's legacy is a trail of violence and intimidation spanning 3 generations. Whatever's in those chambers, it doesn't belong to you anymore. She looked at Jake. As the legal property owner, Mr. Mercer, you'll need to decide what to do about the underground chambers, but that's a conversation for later, after we sort out the immediate criminal matters. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, along with 2 deputy sheriffs who took custody of Thomas Crane. As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, Crane looked at Jake with an expression that mixed defeat with something like respect. You got lucky, Mercer, he said, but luck runs out eventually. Whatever's down there, it'll haunt you the same way it haunted Hartwick. Some secrets don't want to be kept. Jake watched the ambulance drive away, then turned to find Ghost standing beside him, her nose pressed against his shoulder in the familiar gesture of equine affection. He ran his hand along her neck, marveling at the intelligence and timing she'd displayed. Horses were supposed to flee danger, not charge into it to protect their humans. Good girl, he murmured. Best $100 I ever spent was on you, and the second best was on this property. Dr. Morrison approached with the envelope Jake had dropped during the confrontation. You should read what Hartwick left you. It might explain why this place has caused so much trouble. Jake opened the envelope and read Hartwick's final message, written in clear block letters that contrasted with his usual cramped script. To whoever owns this land, the letter began. I never found the chamber, never opened the chest, never learned what the Crane family spent generations protecting. But I learned enough to know this. What's buried here isn't treasure in the conventional sense. It's evidence, documentation of crimes committed during the territorial period by men whose descendants still hold power today. Josiah Crane created 5 repositories across the region to preserve this evidence because he believed someday justice would be possible. His son and grandson spent their lives ensuring that day never came. If you're reading this, you have the chance to do what I couldn't. Open the chambers, bring the evidence to light. Let history judge those who thought they were above judgment. But be warned, this knowledge will make you enemies, and those enemies will have resources I could barely imagine. The choice is yours, but choose wisely. Some fights are worth having, even when you know they'll cost you everything. Jake folded the letter carefully and looked at the property stretching around him. 47 acres of beautiful land hiding secrets that had killed or broken everyone who'd tried to uncover them. He thought about his $117, about the desperate gamble that had brought him here, about ghosts standing beside him and the iron chest waiting in darkness below. The smart choice would be to seal the chambers, forget what he'd learned, and turn this property into the simple ranch he'd originally envisioned. But Jake had never been particularly smart, and desperate men rarely made careful decisions. Besides, he had a white mare who'd proven willing to fight for him, a property bought for a price that suggested destiny rather than coincidence, and a chest full of secrets that someone had tried very hard to keep hidden. Sometimes you didn't choose your fights, sometimes they chose you, and sometimes the only thing left to do was face them head on and hope that desperation and stubbornness would be enough to see you through. Ghost nickered softly, and Jake smiled, scratching behind her ears in the way she liked. Tomorrow they'd start making plans to safely excavate the chambers, to discover what Samuel Hartwick had died seeking, and what Thomas Crane had been willing to kill for. Tonight they'd rest in a house that felt a little less haunted now that its secrets were beginning to come to light. The cowboy who bought the haunted property for $100 had found far more than he'd bargained for, but thanks to his horse, he'd lived to see what came next, and sometimes that was the best outcome anyone could hope for.